here and then we'll turn it over. So thank you everyone for coming. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers of the Socialist Night School. My pronouns are he and him. The Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, and historical events related to socialism. While everyone is welcome, these sessions are especially designed for those who are new to socialism and to DSA. Socialist Night School was started based on the notion that organizing and political education are not properly understood in tension, but rather should be mutually reinforcing. We'll also announce some ways that you can get more involved at the end of the session, which I highly recommend. As we go along, if there are any problems with your audio or video, you can let us know in the chat. I think we'll have time at the end for questions. And so tonight we're going to have Frankie Santos Fritz, who's a student organizer from Silver Spring, Maryland, on the Metro DC DSA Steering Committee. They previously served on the steering committee and was a founding member of the Montgomery County, Maryland branch. Frankie's also just generally a friend of Night School, so we're really excited to be hosting. And so I'm going to turn it over.
Great, thank you so much, David. Yeah, no, it's a real honor to be giving a presentation to Socialist Night School. So I will pull up my slides and share my screen. So can folks see my screen? Awesome.
Yes.
Great. So this presentation, we have some residents of Greenbelt, but I know a lot of folks might, if you're from the DC metro area, you might think of Greenbelt as just the end of the Green Line. I know that's how I thought of it for most of my time living in the DC area. But, you know, beneath that, when you actually go to Greenbelt, you actually look at it and you learn from the history, you actually see that it's a very well preserved kind of public monument to one of the more radical attempts during the New Deal to experiment with different forms of social policy, especially with social housing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. But first, I'd like to start just with a land acknowledgement. Greenbelt, Maryland and the Washington Metro DC chapter are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. We recognize the Piscataway people as the rightful past, present, and future inhabitants of this space. Further, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, and the United States were built with the stolen labor of enslaved African people. I always, in Montgomery County, and in the Metro DC chapter, we always start with the land acknowledgement, and we want to center racial justice in our organizing. I hope that this presentation will uplift some of the systemic injustices of the Jim Crow system of apartheid that Black, Indigenous, and people of color faced during the Jim Crow era in Maryland. And I will say that just as a content warning, there is a discussion in the middle about lynching. It's just to kind of put all of this in context, but that is just a content warning that there is some discussion. There's no graphic images, but there is some discussion of racial violence in this presentation. So the Great Depression obviously started in 1929, hugely disruptive, and I'd love to hear in the chat, when you think of the Great Depression, when you think of that era in history, what are some mental images that are conjured up, or what are some ideas that come to mind when someone talks about the Great Depression? And it doesn't need just to be about housing, but just in general, I'd love to hear what people actually think. Bread lines, hunger, bread lines. Yes, also Cynthia, thank you for that. Poverty, stock market crash. Yes. Okay, so yes, bread lines definitely comes up. This is a bread line in Lexington, Kentucky. Very famous photo, obviously, with that ironic billboard in the back. Famous images of hunger and privation, like Dorothea Lange's migrant mother and child. And then one of these. So this is a shanty town. Does anyone know what the other term for these shanty towns were? So these shanty towns that spread across the United States had a very politically charged name. They were called Hoovervilles. Yes, Hoovervilles. And this one actually is in Central Park, New York. So, in Central Park, or what would become Central Park, these popped up in almost every major metropolitan area, and really showed the how after many years, the extent of the privation during the Great Depression. And, obviously, if you're Herbert Hoover, and they become a major, even if you're not empathetic towards the people living in them, they become a major liability towards your reelection. And I want to talk about one specific Hooverville that actually was here in the Washington, D.C. area. And that was the Hooverville built by the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a march of veterans and their families and supporters after the stock market crash. 3 years, there's been a lot of economic turmoil. 1 in 4 people one in 4 workers found themselves unemployed. And, that was in 1929. By the spring and summer of 1932, people had gotten very desperate. There had been very little relief, especially including on the housing front. So these veterans of World War I marched on Washington and demanded an early payment of their bonuses. They made an encampment in Washington, D.C., very large. People would actually get their mail delivered here. This was a standalone community centered on the banks of the Anacostia River, south of the Capitol. And they lobbied Congress aggressively for the early payment of their bonuses from World War I. And what ends up happening is the House passes a bill allowing for early payment of bonuses, but the Senate, maybe hopefully this doesn't become a common tale in our era, but the Senate kills the legislation, and it leads to protests breaking out. As you can see on the right, the protests become violent. The police attack the protesters. One child is noted to have died of malnutrition. Another child is alleged to have died due to tear gas exposure, and 2 veterans are killed by police. The Bonus Army is finally broken up, and when Herbert Hoover calls in General Douglas MacArthur, tanks and cavalry are called in to force the veterans out of their encampment, and the encampment is burned. So there's a very powerful image, this community would end up staying in the Washington, D.C. area for years after this as well, but their encampment and their protest had been violently repressed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time says something to the effect that, "I no longer need to campaign for president. Mr. Hoover has done it for me." And it's a pretty accurate prediction. Roosevelt ends up defeating Hoover in a massive landslide. And in response to obviously massive protests and militancy from people around the country, we see, just Roosevelt ride in on a wave calling for action to be taken. And on housing, Hoover had a very inadequate response. He calls a conference 1 year before in 1931. He is adamantly against any kind of public support for housing. Herbert Hoover also, says that at best the government maybe has a role in lending money to working people that are close to home ownership but just can't afford it. So giving small loans to homeowners to purchase their own homes, but really wants to focus on individual responsibility and blame people for their own housing situation. His own conference, actually, one of the committees publishes a dissenting report saying that is inadequate and that we need housing to be built. And that conference finds that up to 36% of urban housing in the United States was of substandard quality for human habitation. So during this era, after Roosevelt wins, we find ourselves in a moment of dual crises of rural and urban unemployment. Urban centers are full of blight. There are poorly planned cities with tenement housing that's highly dangerous, catches on fire frequently. Children have experiencing rising cases of rickets, which can be caused by a lack of exposure to the sun, lack of vitamin D. And we see a lot of people really just protesting urban blight. And you actually see even some local business interests finding an interest in doing something about this because it is actually devaluing urban centers where their most valuable real estate is. You also see rural unemployment rising due to the Dust Bowl, but also due to mechanization. The rural economy is being displaced. Tenant farmers are losing their jobs. And there's not a lot of hope for them to get their jobs back after the Depression because a lot of the work that they had been doing was automated. We see FDR does attempt to build new housing through the Public Works Administration. They build 51 during the New Deal, during the duration of the 30s. They built 51 public housing projects, or about 21,000 units. And this is really the first time the federal government gets in the business of building housing. Before this, the only other time the government really had built housing was for World War I. There was a shortage, there was an acute shortage of housing near wartime industries, and there was an interest in building wartime housing and communities for factory workers and bureaucrats to work during the military-industrial complex during World War I. But after that conflict ends, it is dismantled and the federal government returns to its posture of not supporting any kind of intervention in the housing market. So one of the most radical transformation is the Greenbelt Towns program. And it really is remarkable because not only is it public housing, but is also a pilot of future suburban communities to come. You can see on the left a picture of one of the models that was created to kind of show what it would look like. It definitely doesn't look like urban housing, a huge focus on green space. And where this comes from is this man on the right. I wouldn't call him the hero of our story, but he's definitely a protagonist. His name's Rexford Guy Tugwell. And he is a very instrumental figure in securing the funding and planning Greenbelt and its sister Greenbelt town cities. He was a very influential figure, a kind of pariah on the right. He was called FDR's most left-wing advisor. He was derided by critics as FDR's link to the Soviet Union, and he was a lightning rod for conservative attacks and media scrutiny. But he actually comes from a very wealthy pedigree. He's a Columbia University trained economist. He attended the Wharton School of Business before that, and a lot of his associates also come from the Ivy League institutions. So he's an academic first. He's a little skeptical of capitalism, but he's not by any means a communist or even a leftist in any kind of large sense. He serves as FDR's Undersecretary of Agriculture under Henry Wallace, who is also a progressive figure of the era. He goes on to serve as the first ever director of the New York City Planning Commission, where he'll fight over urban planning strategies with Robert Moses. He'll end up losing those battles to Robert Moses. And you could do a whole another talk on his kind of urban policy views in New York City. He's appointed the colonial governor of Puerto Rico by FDR. He's the final appointed colonial governor. And of interest maybe to DSA members is he was also a chair of the Progressive Party 1948, which ran a third-party bid against Harry Truman. They claimed to be holding FDR's New Deal mantle, and they fought for civil rights, and he was their platform committee chair, and he said that if FDR was alive, he wouldn't be supporting Truman, but he would be supporting our third-party effort to break from the Democratic Party. So he's an interesting figure for sure, and really he's the advisor of FDR's that actually kind of takes advantage of this moment in history to get the project planned. He's put in charge of what's called the Resettlement Administration, which is actually a consolidation of 4 different agencies of the New Deal. It only lasted for 2 years. It was charged with building subsistence homestead towns to stabilize those rural communities that were facing large losses of population. There was a recognition, though, as I said before, that a back to the land policy of getting people back into the country, back to small farming, just wasn't a sustainable long-term goal, and that the trend towards urbanization was irreversible. The Resettlement Administration itself would end up being rolled over into the Farm Security Administration of the Department of Agriculture after intense scrutiny, not just of the subsistence programs because of their focus on land reform and cooperative agriculture, but also because of the Greenbelt Towns program and and the intense opposition faced by cities like Greenbelt. So there's this fear of rural and urban migration to slums really becoming, the main response to the housing crisis. There's urban redevelopment efforts by the Public Works Administration, the PWA, but this was costly because they had to purchase the land from what we would call slumlords, pay market prices for that land, and then renovate it or raise the land and build something entirely new on high-cost land in urban centers. Also, the Roosevelt administration desperately wanted to create new jobs through agencies like the Works Progress Administration. You'll see that those are two different acronyms. It's a little confusing, but the Work Progress Administration had the job of hiring people on the unemployment rolls and putting them to work in kind of public works and projects, kind of what we would call workfare. So taking people off the welfare rolls, which was seen as politically unpalatable at the time, and putting them into programs like the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and put them to actual use in that sense in government employment until the economy recovered. Tugwell saw an opportunity to take low-cost agricultural lands that were close to urban job centers and convert them into a new type of community, the suburban community. And this is just to really hit home how different, how expensive it was to build through the Public Works Administration. They would be paying somewhere almost $20,000 an acre for land to do slum clearance programs. The Resettlement Administration would actually pay sometimes almost a tenth of that. Like in Greenbelt, buying land 12 miles outside of Washington, D.C. only cost them $165 an acre. So they borrow from this concept that had been very popular. It was an intellectual movement called the Garden City that's proposed by Ebenezer Howard around the turn of the century. This is the second edition. You see the second edition of his book on the right, The Garden Cities of Tomorrow. There was a high emphasis on community planning of neighborhoods and that green space and common ownership would be the best way to move away from this kind of slum-like conditions, these poor conditions. And so reformers around the time would advocate models like the Garden City, which would have a city center with concentric rings of populations going outwards and connected bands by roads, but a real emphasis on green space to create barriers between communities so that communities actually kind of lived and had a central hub that they were connected to, and then each neighborhood had its own kind of central location as well, with plenty of green space that was commonly owned and commonly managed rather than being managed for profit. Radburn, New Jersey was an early experiment in suburban or urban housing, as they didn't have a word for it yet. And these were mostly conducted by nonprofit foundations like the Russell Sage Foundation. They were really trying to look for an alternative model that would move away from either slums building up around urban centers, or if you look at the earlier period, really try to prevent the creation of company towns so that, a town controlled by one employer maybe built by that one employer, so your employer also charges you rent to live in that community, those were seen as highly undemocratic for the time, and they wanted to move away. They were looking for alternatives. Now, the Garden City would never really come to fruition before the Great Depression, and most of the experiments could not actually find a way to allow working people to live in them. They mostly were upper middle class, or at most middle class experiments. Although one connection to someone who was pretty involved in Greenbelt, Eleanor Roosevelt would serve on the board of the construction company that would build Radburn, New Jersey. So she had a tie to this project before Greenbelt was built. The Resettlement Administration published a report in 1936, kind of demonstrating why they thought they needed to take action. This is kind of just an overview of their mission statement and a list of their major employees who were involved in the planning of these communities. You'll see 4 communities: Greenbelt, Greenbrook, Green Hills, and Greendale. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But the major findings of the report was that almost more than a third of all housing units in urban centers were substandard and not fit for human habitation, and were, quite frankly, dangerous to be living in at the time. And that 63% of urban families lacked affordable housing options. At the time, they defined affordable housing as spending 20% of your income. Now the standard in 2020, and for many years the standard has now been 30%. So back then, the Resettlement Administration thought it was too punishing to ask people to pay more than 20% of their income for housing. So that's an area where we've backslid a lot. Private development had failed, was a finding of the report, that it just could not, the market just could not meet the needs of the working class of the United States, and that the US was falling behind other countries in its ability to produce housing. And that ultimately there was a feeling among the research staff who were pretty progressive. They were actually, some of them were actually left-wing critics of the New Deal who were brought into the fold to kind of participate in this research process. The common notion that housing should be regulated as a public utility and not as a private commodity being the best way forward. So ultimately, the Resettlement Administration is built, or is established in 1935 by Executive Order 7027. The Greenbelt Towns Program is actually created by a jobs bill, not by a housing bill. And this is a really important point. The Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, the ERAA of 1935, that would have a large impact later on, especially around the establishment of it. This was an effort to create jobs very quickly, that Tugwell was able to kind of steer the funding in that bill, which is one of the largest expenditures by the federal government at that time, into his envisioned model communities of Greenbelt towns. So Tugwell had originally imagined 9 towns to be built at a cost of $68 million. Roosevelt would give him $31 million and tell him that, pending the success of that, if you're able to get people hired, if you're able to get these planned, if you're able to get these built, you can have the other $37.5 million later on. Ultimately, only 5 would actually be approved to be worked on with that budget, and only 4 would be executed and planned, and 3 would actually be built. The 3 that would be built were Greenbelt, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., Green Hills, Ohio, outside of Cincinnati, Greendale, Wisconsin, which is outside of Milwaukee. Fun fact, Milwaukee had a supportive local government of the project. Their mayor, Daniel Hone, was a member of the Socialist Party. So Greendale had the best kind of initial reaction to it as a local government. Greenbrook, New Jersey was scuttled by local opposition, by local business interests, and local sellers not wanting to sell, and finally a lawsuit by the local township in New Jersey that would be most impacted, Franklin Township. Now, those stipulations in this jobs bill were very intense and made the construction of Greenbelt very difficult. They had 7 stipulations: that Anything built would have to be permanent. It had to provide a permanent use to whoever it was sold to. That the jobs had to pay a higher income than the welfare dole, but they could not challenge. They had to pay less than the prevailing wage of the region. They could not compete with local employers. So it was highly regulated how much they could pay workers. They had to employ large numbers of people. They had to be self-liquidating. That means that the goal was to whatever was built had to be sold to private interests as quickly as possible, and that there would be no subsidy given to the communities that were purchasing it. They would be sold at cost or for a profit. It had to avoid competition with private industry. It had to scale up employment quickly. And then if there was an economic recovery, it had to be able to scale down that employment just as quickly, laying off the people and forcing them back into the private market as quickly as possible. And then it had to be centered in areas of high unemployment. So these stipulations made it very difficult for Tugwell and the Resettlement Administration to build the city. You can see on the right pictures of workers actually getting started on the construction of the housing. Yes, Walter, that's a great question. We will be getting to that in just a moment, but they were, yes. FDR told Tugwell that he could move forward with the projects on September 12th, and that construction had to begin by December 15th. At this point, there had been no planning, there had been no hiring, nothing had actually started. But Tugwell had 90 days to secure the land, secure the plans, secure the employees, and begin construction. And then they should be finished by June 30th, 1936. Of interest to FDR was 1936 was a re-election year. He would be running for re-election for the first time. So he would want to be able to show a lot of people being added to the payroll quickly. This ends up pretty comically. You can see in the bottom right that they actually are the first workers to get to Greenbelt. Some of them were actually veterans of the Bonus Army March that was attacked by Hoover and MacArthur in 32. These workers, most of them homeless or transient workers, are sent to Greenbelt, and they're told to begin digging a lake, but they cannot use any power tools because this needs to create as many jobs as possible. So they're told to dig a lake by hand. The lake was not an essential part of the city, but they wanted to get as many people to work as quickly as possible. So the program almost dies before it begins. There's a lawsuit by Franklin Township, New Jersey against the Resettlement Administration. This might sound like a local zoning issue. It's not. It ends up being, it is referred to the District Court of Newark, where a local lawyer, Merritt Lane, is given the case. He represents Franklin Township, and he actually works for the Liberty League, which is a grass tops organization founded by the DuPont family to oppose the New Deal. So these legal challenges and conservative interests are seeing an opportunity to use the court system to attack the Resettlement Administration before construction has even begun. The case is referred to DC Federal Court, where the case is taken over by Dean Acheson, who would later become Harry Truman's Secretary of State. He was a former disgruntled Roosevelt administration official who ends up, arguing against the New Deal. And then on May 18th, after an appeal, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia rules that the ERAA that funds Greenbelt had given Roosevelt too much authority and discretion over how to spend funds, and puts a halt on the Greenbrook project. Real estate interests praised the decision. The New York Times and the Washington Post actually write editorials saying that the Supreme Court should take up the issue and challenge it as a way of striking down the Greenbelt program across the entire country. The Harvard Law Review actually does dissent from these opinions and says that not only is this a legal program, but only the federal government has the resources needed to actually execute this kind of housing policy. There is a fear by Roosevelt and his administration, especially by Tugwell, that if they appeal to the Supreme Court and they lose, the entire New Deal could be put in jeopardy, so they pull out of any kind of follow-up. So the Greenbrook project is halted basically before it's begun. And you see the project has gone from initially 9 cities to 5 cities to 4 cities. Now only 3 cities remain in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Greenbelt, Maryland. So construction does begin. There are no future legal challenges that really threaten Greenbelt. They would ultimately create 13,000 jobs, which would make it one of the largest Greenbelt, one of the largest New Deal projects of the era. Skilled trade workers actually make a decent amount of money, $175 an hour, which was a very strong wage for the time. And general laborers would make about 51 cents per hour, which is actually more than most other New Deal agencies were paying. The RA paid better wages, and the project was endorsed by the American Federation of Labor for its investments in these jobs programs, but the AFL does stop short of endorsing the construction of future Greenbelt towns. Finally, it's completed in 1937 after one of the worst winters in DC history with 14 inches of snow. But it finishes with about 885 units compared to about 13,000 units planned that were ready to come online at a total cost of about $13 million or $9,900 per unit. So the tenant selection process began, and it was a very rigorous process that, we talk about social housing and wanting housing to be a human right. This definitely was not the case with Greenbelt. It was very selective. 5,700 families apply for 885 units. It's designed for low-income families, about $1,000 to $2,000 a year. If you made less than that, you were considered in need of relief and very poor. If you made more than that, you were considered middle class. Some families making up to $5,000 a year actually applied to live in Greenbelt. So there was a wide variety of interest. There was a very long and extensive interview process that occurred in Greenbelt. There were background checks, credit checks, interviews with former landlords, interviews with community organizations that members were a part of. There was a real intentionality here to try and build a model community. And unfortunately, that meant trying to appeal to the sensibilities of the time. And there was an exclusion of African-American tenants in the Greenbelt towns. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The town was intentionally 63% Protestant, 30% Catholic, and 7% Jewish, trying to show that there could be that kind of interfaith diversity at the time. And you can see here one of the houses in Greenbelt. That's one of the duplexes split in 2. You can also see that it had very strong amenities, like a swimming pool, very strong recreation centers, campgrounds, and I believe tennis courts, and other amenities that were really considered essential to making this community successful. That this wasn't just going to be housing, but that this would actually be a holistic community that would be a model for communities around the country. And you can even see an interesting facet that I think actually has aged kind of well. That's actually on the bottom right. You see housing, you see the roads have underpasses that you don't need in Greenbelt to get to the town center. You don't need to cross roads. You can actually take these underpasses as a way of avoiding contact with cars. So the community itself, while 12 miles away from DC, was actually very walkable and very centered on facing inwards towards a community center in a kind of, the road system makes a kind of fish hook shaped super block for people to kind of all commune around, which focuses around the town center. Here's some more photos of Greenbelt at the time. There's a great collection in the Library of Congress of these photographs taken by the Resettlement Administration to kind of promote the town. You can see at the bottom left a boy delivering food from the food co-op. You can see the publicly owned movie theater, the Greenbelt Theater, that's still around today. You can see once again, some children riding bikes under the underpass system, parents walking their kids. It was a really interesting community, very young. A lot of federal employees worked there, and the median age of the community was actually 26. So it was a very young community, very excited, and a really vibrant civic society life. There's meetings every single day in the community to kind of talk about politics, newspapers, dozens of the records show that there are dozens of clubs that start in the first few weeks, to the point where I think in the first year they had a meeting where the city declared a moratorium on meetings. They decided that there were too many meetings to go to and that they needed to take a break because people were trying to start so many organizations so quickly that they didn't have time to participate in them. And yes, the food co-op is still there and still thriving. And then at the bottom right, you see one of the apartment buildings being constructed as well. It was a mixed stock of housing, duplexes, and apartment buildings. The other, Greendale, Wisconsin, is the only one that used single family housing. The rest were kind of this kind of contemporary functional style that focused on duplexes and apartments. And that was based on a lot of rigorous research done by the planners. They did a survey of Washington, D.C. area residents, asking what kind of conditions would they want to live in. 45% said a row house, and 22% said an apartment. So a majority of people really were fine with not living in a single family house. So it's very important to highlight that this was a segregated city. And that comes out of the context of Maryland in the 1930s. It was black labor and white labor, but black labor, that was only white workers were allowed to actually reside here. The New Deal would hire around 2 million African Americans, but policies disproportionately excluded Black Americans. 2/3 of Black Americans would be excluded from the minimum wage, from Social Security, from unemployment insurance, from the National Labor Relations Act, because the industries that were allowed to unionize excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers. So these reform laws that were passed disproportionately protected white workers in white industries. Greenbelt simply did not challenge the prevailing white supremacist order of the time. And this comes out of Maryland's history as a slave state. It was a border state during the Civil War. It abolished slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. Almost 2 years afterwards, the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln only abolished slavery in rebelling states. Maryland waited almost 2 more years to narrowly vote to abolish human chattel slavery. The other Greenbelt towns would be built in non-slave Union states, Ohio and Wisconsin. Maryland was the final state to legalize interracial marriage, the same year as the Loving versus Virginia case. So interracial communities would not have been welcomed in Maryland until much later. And Maryland's last recording lynching occurred in 1933 during FDR's administration, and only 2 years before white and black workers broke ground on Greenbelt. And I'll talk about that in a second, but it's important to note that Roosevelt did not want to anger the southern part of his coalition, of the New Deal coalition, by supporting anti-lynching legislation. So the case of George Armwood occurs in Maryland 2 years before Greenbelt is founded. In Princess Anne, Maryland, George Armwood is a 22-year-old man who's accused of assaulting an elderly white woman. He was described as mentally feeble, and he was working in conditions, instead of being sent to a mental institution, he was put in working conditions that were called by the NAACP peonage, ignorance, and serfdom. He would actually be taken, he would be captured and beaten by police. He was taken to Salisbury, Maryland, and then to Baltimore City, because there had been previous lynchings in Maryland where the local population had really broken through police lines to commit these murders. And there's a concern that that would happen again. Now, the local politicians pressured the governor, Governor Ritchie of Maryland, to return Armwood back to Princess Anne. And within one day, a mob of 1,000 people had assembled outside of the jail. And the police asked the crowd to disperse. They fired tear gas into the crowd, but the mob broke through the police barricade, and they murdered, they beat and murdered George Armwood in the street outside of the jail. 12 out of those 1,000 people, only 12 were identified as suspects, and only 4 were put on trial. The jury acquitted those men, it dismissed the charges against them, and there's still been no justice in that case till today. And the lynching of George Armwood actually became a national rallying cry for the NAACP. Here's a poem that was on their cover of their magazine, The Crisis, in 1940. So that's the context under which Greenbelt had been built, the apartheid system that you can really see really visibly here. This is a two remarkable photographs I found of the Resettlement Administration in Greenbelt. The white workers were given on-site temporary erected housing. Black workers were driven to and from DC every day to sleep in a warehouse. And that's really just a huge disparity. And there's not, I don't apologize for it. And I really, just to discuss it a little further, I don't really know what the alternative would have been. There was massive local opposition to building it in Greenbelt, to building Greenbelt in the city. And it's not clear if it would have been built elsewhere. But local politicians in Prince George's County violently opposed any kind of integration and any kind of developments. There are other housing projects that, if you're interested, that you can actually examine in the DC area. Initially, before Greenbelt was even planned, there was a proposed homestead farm community in Rossville, which would have called Rossville, but it was scuttled by local opposition from Prince George's County politicians. Langston Terrace is a still existent housing project today, Washington, D.C. You can still see the architecture and the public artwork that was built there. It was offered as a reason why people could not live in Greenbelt, why African Americans could not live in Greenbelt. They were referred to live in Langston Terrace, although Langston Terrace also housed white Americans as well. So it was not an exclusively African American community. And then one project by the Resettlement Administration was Aberdeen Gardens in Hampton, Virginia. That was funded by a $245,000 grant to house African Americans near Hampton University. So these are some community projects that did exist. There were some, but not many still exist, and that history hasn't been preserved as well. Aberdeen Gardens is actually the last of these Resettlement Administration housing units that still exists, that you can still kind of visit, and it's been memorialized. So, yeah. So just a quick, and there was a very strong, Greenbelt did not challenge the gender dynamics of the time either. There was an expectation that working women could not live in Greenbelt. Women were not expected to work. They were expected to not hold employment. While there was a strict income band that families couldn't fall below or go above, they really had to stay within that band. There's a strict regulation of tenant conduct, including, these are very highly regulated communities, especially in Greenbelt. The one very odious regulation was that you could not have your clothes hanging out on a clothesline after 4 p.m. And you could not have your clothes hanging out at all on Sundays. So clothing had to be dried and back in the home very early in the day. Other bands of tenant conduct, you could not own a dog in Greenbelt, and that actually was criticized by the New York Times of all publications in the city limits. But women were very involved in the building of a community in Greenbelt. Women were some of the founders. I'm going to turn the light on. Women were some of the founders of many of the organizations in the city, including a daycare cooperative. Variety of women's organizations existed. Elizabeth Harrington was elected the first mayor of Greenbelt in 1949, and women such as Lenore Thomas Strauss played a major role in the public artwork of Greenbelt. You can see that statue in Roosevelt Center in Greenbelt City, in Old Town Greenbelt rather, today. That's a piece called Mother and Child. In line with Howard's Garden, as Ebenezer Howard's Garden city's vision of common space and common responsibility, and in line with the economic instability of the Great Depression, there was a very strong focus on cooperative economics in the city. You can see the still operating food co-op today, but here's some pictures of the co-op back in, I believe, the late 1930s, could be the early 1940s. But they featured numerous cooperatives, including a health center, a supermarket, credit union, and a cooperative newspaper that still publishes today called the Greenbelt News Review. Back then it was called the Greenbelt Cooperator. It has published regularly since the city's founding in 1937. And really, they still make up a very strong part of the city's culture today. There's the Greenbelt Cooperative Alliance, and these are some of the participants in that group: Greenbelt Co-op and Supermarket, Credit Union, the Greenbelt Housing Cooperative, Greenbelt Homes Incorporated, Greenbelt, I believe it's a community space, makerspace cooperative. The News Review is a newspaper, a nursery school, and the New Deal Cafe, which I've been to multiple times. They have very good vegan cuisine, and I highly recommend you check it out. And I've heard that they also have very good jazz shows as well, and very great live music. So one last thing that I want to really stress about Greenbelt is that it really came under intense scrutiny from the national press. You know, it's kind of a very strong, if you lived in the community, it probably had a very strong fishbowl dynamic. The communities were derided as Tugwell towns as opposed to Hoovervilles, and Soviet communes, similar to Soviet communes. The Philadelphia Inquirer actually says in a piece titled "Tugwell Hands Out 1.8 Million for New Jersey Commune," attacked the Greenbelt Project in Greenbrook, New Jersey, as a model of Russian-Soviet commune that would lead to the emigration of 200 Jewish needle workers, headed by a Russian-born little Stalin, that being Tugwell, who will be running their cooperative not less than 50 miles from the birthplace of American democracy. So outside of Philadelphia. So very strong opposition from the press. There's actually a great documentary about the cooperator in the Greenbelt News Review, about the early struggles to try and correct the record and try and talk about why these perceptions of their community were wrong and, you know, politically charged, but ultimately just not really realistic about the community that they were trying to build together. Ultimately, Greenbelt would be sold. It had always been intended to be sold off to private interests, especially during the McCarthyite pressure of the 50s. There's a big pressure to divest, and the project is ultimately liquidated. Some of the property is actually purchased by a veterans community that becomes what is now known as the Greenbelt Housing Cooperative. And it does maintain some of this affordable housing stock to this day as in a cooperative manner. But ultimately, the assets were sold off, and the final sale of federal property kind of concluded in 1954. So you might say, okay, that's great. This has been a very informative presentation, but you know, why would I kind of bring everyone here and ask them to talk about Greenbelt, Maryland? And really, the reason why I think Greenbelt is so important is it shows us a very divergent path than the one we took when it comes to housing policy. When we actually talk about the crises we're trying to face now of affordable housing, the mass eviction crisis we're facing, can we secure housing as a human right, all while fighting the existential crisis of climate change, is really an open question. And I think housing is going to be a critical part of the fight for a Green New Deal and for economic security for all working families in the United States. So that in that divergent path, we took a very different path. Instead of kind of looking to move towards a utility model of housing that makes it more accessible and affordable for all working families, the suburb does actually become a very dominant mode of housing people. But that's really at the cost of a lot of communities of color, of urban communities. The GI Bill and the Housing Act of 1949 subsidize housing that in the suburbs. It actually makes it cheaper and more economical for a lot of white families to purchase a home than it is to rent. Highway policy creates very sprawling neighborhoods that are not walkable, car-connected communities that really exacerbate our climate crisis. Community planning that Tugwell had envisioned has given way to developer-led planning that's mostly entirely about making profit rather than social cohesion. And the biggest subsidy we actually give for housing is the housing mortgage interest deduction. And as you can see on the right, this graph here shows who actually receives it. The highest income families that make over $200,000 a year actually receive 60% of the housing support from the housing mortgage interest deduction. And as you can see, it's a very regressive system that our biggest housing policy is our tax code. And we have really done it in a way that encourages people to purchase homes. And our planning policy over the last, since World War II, has really been to put those homes in very unsustainable, sprawling communities. And if you compare that amount every year, how much we give in support for that mortgage interest deduction versus how much we give to renters in forms of Section 8, we give, this is in 2017, we give about $30 billion a year in rental support, but $71 billion a year in subsidies to homeowners to pay off the interest on their mortgages. Public investment in public housing has tapered off. We've moved to a voucher system. We've moved to a system of building housing through tax credits, which is closer to what Herbert Hoover would have proposed than what I think Tugwell and Roosevelt had tried to build. And the most regressive policies after what was seen after the 60s and the 70s and the 80s as the quote unquote failure of public housing leads to what's called the Faircloth Amendment in 1998, which requires that any unit of public housing built with federal dollars if you build a single unit, you must take another unit offline. That is still a fight that we're fighting today. And the fight to repeal the Faircloth Amendment was actually led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So we find ourselves in a moment where urban centers rather than suburbs have become the dominant real estate markets. People again are being drawn to, and this is all before the pandemic. We don't know where the trends after the pandemic will go. But people once again are being drawn towards economic opportunity, and we actually see poverty on the rise in our urban areas. The climate crisis necessitates that we move towards a more transit-oriented form of land use. We simply cannot electrify enough cars to get to the climate goals that we're trying to achieve. And that's going to require a very large change to our housing stock and to our land use policies. And I think that we need to know, how are we going to get out of our current crisis that has led to so many people facing evictions, especially now that vaccination rates are rising? Will there be continued economic relief for renters? Or will we see this kind of trend towards, liquidation of these housing markets? I don't know. And how will we respond to the housing crisis of our era? And that's why I think Greenbelt is so important. I think that Greenbelt is the closest thing we've had in this country towards a kind of example of social housing. Not housing that kind of isolates communities, but actually encourages communities to thrive, has strong public amenities, and is really trying to be a model for how we can live sustainably and adapt to changing economic circumstances. So Greenbelt ultimately tells us how the project can overcome certain hurdles, either both within the government, from legislators, from the courts, from business interests in the media. They were able to build a vibrant community that was interested in making housing a utility, not a commodity. It didn't challenge the existing gender and racial norms of the time, and that was a huge failure of the program. Now, there's an argument over how much Roosevelt could have done. I definitely think he could have done more. I don't know how much he could have done in that moment. And I think that's an open debate. But his response definitely, in retrospect, seems totally inadequate for the time. Communities, it does show that we can have suburban communities that were walkable and cooperative rather than just developed for private profit. And that Greenbelt was a model for how we can actually look at home ownership in a way that challenged capitalism and didn't really just focus on subsidizing the industries at high cost, and really focused on housing, moving towards a system where everyone could be housed. So that's really what I learned from studying Greenbelt and putting it in the context of today's debate. But it's important to realize that, as one of my favorite historians, Howard Zinn, says, that Greenbelt, like any other New Deal program, was made possible even under the immense challenges it faced from capital, the immense challenges it faced and criticism it faced from politicians and the media, because there was a realization that capitalism had to be reorganized. And Greenbelt was one attempt to do that. And that was only because Greenbelt was built in 1935, but the Great Depression had started 6 years earlier. And there had been nonstop organizing by people across the country in every major metropolitan area to stop evictions. Tenant farmers had fought to keep their livelihoods. There was a militant struggle, and Greenbelt was in response to that. And that it was that pressure from below that ultimately makes these projects possible. And Roosevelt showed that he could overcome opposition from the courts under enough pressure. He was reelected, and then he threatened to pack the courts. And after that, the courts stopped striking down New Deal programs. Greenbelt ultimately shows us that when working people build movements that are strong enough, they can really change what we thought was immovable policy of the United States government, that the government would always leave housing to the free market. And Greenbelt is an example that we are able to break through that in our context. It falls short, but it also still survives to this day as part of a legacy that of this organizing and of this power of the federal government to actually take action and accede to popular demands in the moment. So that's my presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
All right, so thank you so much. And if people have questions, we're going to ask them to post them in the chat, and I will pose them to Frankie, and we'll go from there. And while we're waiting to see if anybody does, I'm going to start with one of my own. I know you talked about the role of experts in kind of envisioning this sort of community.
Yeah.
But obviously there were demands for housing from the movement, from all these people had been displaced and all that sort of thing. But I wonder if you have any sense whether there was a demands from below beyond housing. Were people asking for this type of community, or was it really people just kind of wanted housing and these experts had this notion of that type of community?
Yeah, I think there was a demand for that kind of housing. It really, this idea that working people could only expect squalor, I think, was very dominant. A suburb of working people, the first suburbs we talk about, Radburn and other experiments, there were suburbs in a sense, outer communities outside of the city that actually exemplify, suburbanity, but they're called slums. And I think that this idea that you could have a working class thriving community was really what was behind Greenbelt, this idea that working people deserve better than living in squalor. You didn't need to be dangerous to live in these communities. Tugwell does know that, Tugwell and the Resettlement Administration note in their reports before the construction of Greenbelt that, there are protests over the amount of violence, the clustered poverty, the lack of proximity to community. It's really it wasn't just that there's a demand for housing, but that housing itself did not need to be of inferior quality. That working people could demand um, a little bit of luxury, even. Obviously, we didn't go into really the internal architecture of these homes, but by comparison, some of these homes have been a huge improvement over the conditions that some of the previous inhabitants were living in. Some community, they had power refrigerators. They had refrigerators, and they had I'm kind of blanking on the complete amenities that they had, but you can definitely visit them today. And these are buildings that were built to last, and they have, and they're a little small by contemporary standards, but for a working family of the time, it was really an incredible change in living standards. And people who got into these communities really felt like they had won the lottery, because it was very competitive to get in.
Do you know if there were demands from the people who didn't get in for building similar communities or expanding it out, or did, when people did make it, was it more fatalism, that sort of thing?
Yeah, because only 3 were built, I'm not the yeah, I don't think that there was, as far as I'm aware, any kind of pushback from the people who didn't get in, that was organized. Now, it is interesting, once people get into the communities, they actually do get organized as a community, and they organize together um, to fight for amenities, to fight for transit policies. They protest changes to the buses that take commuters into the city. It was quite difficult actually to get from Greenbelt initially if you didn't have a car, which a large percentage of the population didn't. A lot of people carpooled. So there was a lot of organizing once people lived in Greenbelt against rent increases. There was organizing on transit policies. But yeah, I can't say that people were organized. There was any kind of organized blowback if people didn't get in. And there was a kind of understanding that Roosevelt wasn't going to build anymore. After Roosevelt takes a tour with Tugwell, being the lightning rod that he is, announces his resignation. And the project is kind of put on ice after that. 3 communities are built out of a promised 9. It's attacked by conservative Democrats as being over budget and being, excess, as any kind of public program. Expansion was always criticized for being too generous for working people.
Thank you. So we've got a couple questions here, I think. So hold on. Claire asks, where did the residents work? How did the working people get to their jobs, given what you were just talking about?
Yeah, so most of them worked for the federal government. Yeah, there's not a lot of industry that's actually built in Greenbelt proper. Even though it is sold off, they don't really attempt to build a lot of local businesses or industry. although Greenbelt today is a pretty vibrant city, one of the larger communities in Prince George's County. Most of them were federal employees, and there's a lot of tumult that actually happens. The initial cohort is pretty tightly knit together, and they have this kind of common experience of having been kind of the founding generation of Greenbelt. But a lot of them are displaced by World War II as federal employees. They're moved around, and the community changes in character very quickly. About 1,000 more units of housing are added during World War II as defense housing, not as nice quality, but the community is expanded, but kind of contemporary accounts and historical reviews kind of show that the community kind of died off because of a lot of turnover during the Second World War. How they got to work, some people carpooled. There's actually a manual that you can read from the Greenbelt, the Farm Security Administration management guide. So the tenant's guide, when you get in, you get a manual. There's actually a section that says some of the carpoolers have taken to this habit of honking their horns when they're outside the people they're carpooling with. We ask that you stop it. So it was a frequent enough problem that people were told to stop honking their horns for their carpool partners. And they go to more of a model of a lot of people also I'm glad the quality is great. Sorry, and there's kind of a struggle because there people take a bus to a nearby city in Prince George's County that will then take them to a second bus that takes them to another bus, and it's not really until the people of Greenbelt get cars that they actually have stable transportation. That is one of the things that isn't as well planned about the city, that internally it's very walkable, but it is a little far removed. And even compared to the other Greenbelt towns, it's far from the city center. But carpool and bus are the main way that they get around. But when bus services are interrupted or cut, there's often protests and organizing by transit activists in the city. And I'll say that even to this day, there's a lot of very active transit activists in Greenbelt, which now does, you can take a bus from the terminal of the Green Line to Greenbelt. I think it's about a 12 to 15 minute ride just based on Google Maps. I've never taken that, but I have driven. It's about 30 minutes from me in Silver Spring.
So Kate asked, did the Greenbelt maintain the exclusionary entry requirements after the initial selection of residents, or did that stop once the housing was sold? Was there much fluctuation in this socioeconomic / racial dynamic since then?
Yes, so Greenbelt is actually, like Prince George's County, has gone from a majority white suburb to a vibrant, center of the Black middle class. Prince George's County has some of the most affluent African-American communities in the country. And that's a fascinating kind of transition along with the greater DC metropolitan area. Yes, they maintained the exclusionary. I don't know when they might have dropped it. I think it's still an open discussion of when Greenbelt was integrated. But my understanding is that the council passes a fair housing ordinance the Greenbelt City Council passes a fair housing ordinance in '67 saying that any exclusionary policy should be stopped. I'll say that it wasn't unusual for the 1930s for suburbs to be racially exclusive. A lot of early housing, even after World War II, was governed by a racial covenant. So there was a line in your deed and many deeds actually today still say this, that you're not allowed to sell to this group, that group, or this group. So definitely by the '60s, the city passes a fair housing ordinance banning housing discrimination. But it is not, yes. And I'll say that the other thing is that there isn't as much turnover in the co-op as there is in other forms of housing. I mean, that's kind of part of the nature co-ops. So, it does retain that kind of exclusionary nature, but I don't know. I don't think they've ever there's been a solid conclusion on when the town was integrated. I would say that the mayor, Colin Bird, is the second, I believe, African-American mayor of Greenbelt, and is actually a Metro DC DSA member in his own right.
One question I had is, and I don't know a ton about social housing, and need to learn more, but it seems to me when I've read, there often is a focus on community. It's not just about people having their good housing, but it seems like when I've read, it's usually sort of community at like a building level. Whereas what you're talking about is really the whole community. And I wonder how unique that is to discussions of social housing, or maybe that's just more common. I don't know about it.
Yeah, I think part of it is for social housing. I think that there's if you look at the kind of the biggest example of social housing is in Vienna, Austria, is considered like the gold standard of social housing, based on an era roughly contemporaneous with Greenbelt called Red Vienna after World War I. And currently, the city of Vienna has a four-tier matrix on how they evaluate new housing projects. They evaluate them on cost effectiveness. They evaluate them on ecological sustainability, on social cohesion, and on, okay, I'm going to blank on the fourth one, and on aesthetic design. So it's a kind of a four. They bid it out to private developers, and the developers have to kind of justify it and be scored on this matrix of affordability, social cohesion, aesthetic and architectural value, and ecological sustainability. And these are large communities, but also say that the difference is that a lot of social housing is urban. It is centered in urban centers and near jobs. And in the United States, especially, suburban communities have rejected not just public housing, but dense housing in a lot of cases as well. I live in Montgomery County, which is, one of the most affluent counties in the country. In the 1960s, as you see white flight occurring, Montgomery County is one of the larger counties in the region. It only took about 10% of the apartment housing stock of the entire region. Most apartments were being built in the District of Columbia. So I think that the building by building nature, that's kind of trying to tap into economies of scale. But Greenbelt, was intentionally kind of designed in a way to spatially kind of spread people out, but in a way that was still a walkable kind of community. And I think that's important because we're seeing how communities, suburban communities now, increase in poverty. Poverty is spiking in suburban communities, and before the recession, it was spiking faster in suburban communities than it was in other communities, as we see kind of gentrification occurring. So as we try to repair old housing stock in the suburbs, is there ways we can redevelop in more spread out communities for more density, but also to be more internally cohesive and walkable? I think that is, I think that public housing can't just be an urban phenomena. And I think that Greenbelt shows that it doesn't have to be.
Can folks on the phone ask a question? Or make a
Sure,
comment?
go ahead. Go for it.
Unfortunately, I'm listening on the phone because I never seem to get a live link to DSA events. But that aside, I look forward to seeing a recording, visual recording of this. Frank, it's a very interesting and problematic history of Greenbelt that you presented on your slides, which I did not see. It's interesting, what was the social dynamic when the Veterans Housing Cooperative took over Greenbelt? And it's unclear to me. It sounded like you had said that before the Veterans Housing Cooperative bought the homes, the other land that was within the corporate Greenbelt limits were sold off separately.
Yes.
And it's only an impression I have is that the Veterans Housing Cooperative sold off much of that land that it was able to buy from the feds. But the question in my mind is the dynamic that existed when Greenbelt was created is different, certainly, than the dynamic today. But why is it that the many activities that the early cooperators were enthusiastically involved with today is not replicated today? There are many residents involved in many activities, but there's, I think, not an equal relationship of residents to city government as there was in its early years. And can you pair the three Greenbelt towns to more modern new towns, such as in this area, Reston and Columbia, and how development develops in those communities?
Yeah, so Greenbelt is different than Reston, especially in Columbia. Those were driven communities. Those were developer-driven communities, but those developers did see themselves as having a social mission. So Greenbelt was designed by the federal government, Columbia, and there's a great book about this. I recommend very highly. You can get it. I encourage you buying it from the Greenbelt Museum bookstore if you can. But it's called Radical Suburbs, and they actually do discuss the kind of new towns in the 1960s and later. They have a social mission. Columbia was designed with the goal of integrating. Like that was it was a social enterprise. Obviously, it was still trying to make a profit, but it was trying to show that integration could be possible in a market economy. Greenbelt was trying to respond to the deficits of the market economy. Now, I want to say that you should put market economy in scare quotes there, because all these things were only made legal because of the decades-long struggle for fair and equal housing and other civil rights gains that were fought by activists in the courts that plenty of developers were agnostic to or downright oppositional to. As to the community element, I can't speak to Greenbelt today, but there really was a sense when you first moved there that you had won the lottery, that you were part of a new community. I mean, someone was the first person to move into Greenbelt, and then there's the first 100 people to move into Greenbelt. You all knew each other. You all were you had been interviewed, and you had basically said, why do you want to live here? And you didn't have to have a certain ideological persuasion. There was a bit of diversity in ideological persuasion, but you had to be you had to be a working class, as defined by the Resettlement Administration. But B, you had to actually kind of have a commitment to the success of this community. You couldn't just be someone who's just going to live there. So it was intentionally selected. People were intentionally selected because they would participate in community and had really involved histories. And I think that, once again, World War II is really the big thing that changes the community as well. That initial cohort is disrupted. A lot of housing is added, and it's not just based on, the government needs to house people in the DC metro area to help conduct the war. So that does change the nature of it. And then afterwards, a lot of the core institutions, the cooperative institutions, come under pretty vigorous attack. The town does rally to the defense of the cooperative grocery store, and they don't really want to allow any other stores in initially. But free market capitalism, doesn't respect, just the democratic vote. There are legal barriers to preventing businesses from operating in the United States. So they kind of eventually do erode the support. While a lot of people still are members of these cooperatives, they're no longer the dominant mode of how people interact with one another. So turnover, the main historian of the era, Joseph Arnold, does say something to the effect of, that this kind of democracy, in his view, and I tend to agree with this, you do need a kind of community that comes together to make it work. Otherwise, if people don't have those kind of personal relationships and that kind of intentionality, the project is very hard for it to succeed, especially amid all the other pressures it's facing.
All right, so this one you may or may not know this, but someone asked, I think it was Max, how did NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center end up in Greenbelt? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I would love if a Greenbelter has the answer to that, that's a little beyond my scope. Now, Greenbelt the reason for Greenbelt being placed there, and the reason why Greenbelt is started first, is actually construction on Greenbelt starts first, is because it's actually land that has already been optioned by the federal government to be built for the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. So I know it does try to become a research hub, and I do know that it is a major change to the landscape of Greenbelt to have the Goddard Center there, and it does reflect the changing dynamics of the area. But by the time Greenbelt is there, I believe, by the time the Goddard Center is built, I believe the Capital Beltway has already been constructed. I could be wrong about the timeline on that, but I think partially it is just, it's part of the infrastructure of DC. It's kind of no longer this kind of island anymore. But Greenbelt cuts right, the city center is right off the Capital Beltway. It's not long to get there at all. So I will say that it's more so that government buildings move further out rather than, and there is a trend in the 70s towards more suburban office parks. That is a trend that as white families move out into the suburbs, jobs also move out into the suburbs, and you see the rise of the suburban job park, which now a lot of corporations are actually moving back into urban centers. So you see this push and pull between centralization in cities of economic activity, then spatial desegregation or despatialization out into the suburbs. But if someone knows why it was added to Goddard, and is apparently officially outside of the city limits.
Yeah, other questions, you can put them in the chat. One question I had is you pointed out there's obvious connections between the stuff you're talking about here and things that are kind of live political issues today around housing, around climate change. But I'm wondering, could you talk at all about the organizing that's happening in Maryland on those issues, and whether you see people drawing connections back to Greenbelt as you have?
Yeah. So there is Maryland. Maryland does really have a lot of work to be done in the housing space. I think a lot of work has started with right now our legislature. A lot of tenants are trying to organize in our legislature to get basic protections like just cause eviction laws. So in the state of Maryland, your landlord does not need any pretext to not renew your lease. And there's a growing tenants movement here in Montgomery County around that, led by my delegate, Janelle Wilkins, and then a DSA endorsed delegate, Vaughn Stewart, actually did make the connection. He's a fan of Greenbelt, and he has actually been kind of pushing a social housing bill in the legislature, trying to get pilot funding. And the difference between traditional public housing and social housing is that in his bill, the housing would have to be built near transit, and it would have to be for all income groups. At any income, there'd be specifically set aside housing for every income group to actually finance, so that higher income tenants actually help finance amenities and subsidize lower rents for lower income tenants. And that's a big problem that we have with our public housing system in the United States, is that for a very long time, the federal government, when it did actually pay for new public housing, that money could only be used for what's called operational, it could only be used for capital expenses. So the federal government would pay to build a building, but then tenants would be completely dependent upon their building agencies from local funding, which was very scarce, or from their rent for maintenance. So maintenance would actually be put back on the working people themselves to pay for after the government had built these very expensive buildings. You know, high rises are quite expensive in a lot of cases. So, you know, the lack of any kind of middle and upper income tenants really did set up a lot of public housing authorities for failure, because there's a very strong and very deeply rooted in anti-socialist and anti-communist politics push against any kind of competition for middle income and higher income tenants. So we do see a change in that today. And, you know, Greenbelt did not have that kind of flexibility. There was an upper income limit, and people were threatened with eviction when they made too much money to stay in Greenbelt. So that is one thing that has that Greenbelt, I don't think, did correctly.
That is wild. Yeah, so last call for questions. Anyone have questions? You can put them in the chat there. I'll give you a minute or so.
I want to acknowledge Megan Searing Young, who's actually the director of the Greenbelt Museum. I would love if you would, if you're able to talk and just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the museum. I want to say, once again, this presentation so much builds upon, you know, how much I enjoyed my visits to the museum.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much. That was really great. And thank you for acknowledging us. We are looking forward to being open again so we can resume our house tours and things like that. We do have lots of content online at our website, and we are going to start up with walking tours again. So if anybody's interested in those, they'll be socially distanced. And since we're already outdoors and the weather's getting better, we're looking forward to that. So, and I did just want to add that we just did a program about how Greenbelt was started to become desegregated, and that is on our YouTube channel. So you can check that out. We set up an interview with a woman who, she and her husband were some of the first people of color to move into, I think they were the first to move into the housing co-op, and that was in 1966. I've recently also found out that another family moved in 1 year earlier into Boxwood Village, which was a community that was built as sort of infill development in Greenbelt. So, but this is work we're really working hard on to try to track down this information, because it's so important that we make sure everyone understood that Greenbelt was utopia, but only if you were a white family. So thank you for, you know, this great presentation and for spreading the word about Greenbelt.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. So glad you could join. And yeah, I actually have one more slide just to share, folks, some other quick resources. So just a couple of great resources. If you want to do more reading, the kind of authoritative history of Greenbelt was written by Joseph Arnold. It was his doctoral dissertation. He was then a professor at the University of Maryland, but it's the New Deal in the Suburbs, a history of the Greenbelt towns. Presentation draws heavily from his book. It's very readable, and there's even like good breakdowns of sections. It's not in print, so you have to find it. And also his PDF is for free online if you look for it, if you Google it. But you can find it. It's a great read. And then a more recent book that is in print and you should buy is Amanda Colson Hurley's Radical Suburbs, Experimental Living on the Fringes of the American City. It talks about a variety of suburbs and kind of the changing nature of suburbia and how suburbia wasn't always this kind of white picket fence concept that we have now, but it actually always was a kind of, always did have a kind of radical undercurrent of people trying to live on the fringes of our cities. The Greenbelt News Review, there's a movie about the Greenbelt News Review at 80. You can find that on Vimeo for free. And then there's a documentary made contemporarily with Greenbelt called The City. And it's kind of positing that the suburb, it's kind of predicting that the suburb will become the next big thing, and uses Greenbelt as a good example of that. And then obviously the Greenbelt Museum at 15 Crescent Road in Greenbelt. You can visit them at greenbeltmuseum.org. And then I also drew from the Living New Deal which is a great archive. I will say that I disagree a little bit with them, just a little bit with them, to say that I think that they're a little too celebratory of FDR, but they do a lot of great chronicling of New Deal assets, and there's actually a great map that you can look at to see what New Deal projects occurred in your area, and some of them still exist today, then you can visit them. So as you think of a New Deal, as we think of a Green New Deal, you can also kind of look at, you know, what has been left on our landscape from the original New Deal.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderful. I'm so glad we were able to do this. I learned a lot. If anyone is here on the call who represents some element of DSA that would like to do a pitch for the stuff you're working in, ways people can get involved, maybe let us know in the chat and we'll let you do that. Chip, if you're still here, I don't know if you have anything you can announce for future night schools coming up.
We don't have a date, but the next night school is going to be on Eugene Debs and will feature Sean Good of Jacobin, but we are still finalizing the date.
Other things is that if you would like to get more involved in Socialist Night School, you can talk to me or Chip. You can also email us at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. You can check us out on the chapter Slack at night-school and on Twitter at nightschool_DC. And if you're in Nova, you should join the book club where they're reading The Color of Law, which would go very well with this also. All right. So yeah, I think with that, we will call it a night. Thank you so much, Frankie, again for this presentation. Thank you everyone for your great questions. I was able to grab the chat. I can share that back with you, Frankie. Hope we can see you all at future night schools or at other DSA events, and have a good night.
Thank you.